Did you know that a residential fuel oil spill can impact the resale value of your home, affect your health, and also damage the environment? It takes only 1 ounce of fuel oil to contaminate 600,000 liters of water. There's still hundreds of fuel oil spills a year being reported. Hi, I'm Jim Zaida from North Waterloo Farmers Mutual Insurance Company, Loss Prevention Department. Today we'd like to take the time to share with you some very helpful loss prevention tips that could help you reduce your exposure to ever having a residential oil spill. As a rural insurer since 1874, we've been insuring many different types of heating systems, and we feel there's absolutely nothing wrong with oil heating systems, provided your system is installed to code and well maintained and always serviced annually by a certified heating technician. Some of the most common causes of fuel oil spills are as a result of equipment not being serviced annually by a professional, improper installations, improper equipment being used, lack of protection, and overfilling by suppliers. Let's go have a look, and we'll point out some very helpful tips on how you can reduce your exposure on two of the most common types of installations, the inside tank and outside tank installation. Most insurers and service technicians will tell you they prefer inside tanks over the outside tanks, and we'll explain to you today why. This is your typical outdoor residential fuel tank that we're going to discuss. First of all, some of the key things you should always note is that proper vent pipes are in place, proper tank gauge is in place to measure how much fuel is in your tank, and that the vent pipes are more than 2 feet away from any doors or windows. Also, that it's important that you check and make sure the tank has a proper label and that it's ULC approved. The problem with outdoor tanks is they're subject to the elements, the weather. They're subject to things dropping off roofs, impacting the tank, breaking lines if they're not protected. The weather itself. Tanks initially come with a primer coat on them, such as this one that's never been painted, so they start to have heavy corrosion early on in life. They're not on stable bases. Usually it's just 2 concrete pads instead of a solid cement pad that we prefer, 8 inches thick with at least 12 inches of gravel underneath that with the topsoil removed. Let's take a look now at the discharge end of the outdoor fuel tank. There's a lot of key things that are important here where the fuel line discharges from the tank. First of all, that the fuel tank has a proper discharge and shutoff valve, which this one does. Another important thing is that the fuel line and discharge valve is protected from overhead ice and snow and objects falling down that could snap it. Even as much as regular traffic, kids, people running around the house. During the winter months when the line's covered up with snow, people could step on it accidentally. So it's important to have shielding over this. Another important thing is that the fuel line have an expansion loop. Expansion loops are really critical because on outdoor tanks you've always got movement, especially if they're only located on 2 cement slabs. Frost moves the tank up and down. The expansion loops allow for some flexibility in the line instead of causing it to snap at one of the joints or fracture the line. So an expansion loop is very important, and as you can see on this tank, there is no expansion loop. The other good thing about this installation is it's using the new updated line, which is the new copper line protected with the orange coating, which is much better than in the old days. We were just using the copper line, which corroded, deteriorated when it touched concrete and other foreign objects. What this outside installation does not have, though, when the fuel line leaves and enters into the building, it should be protected through a piece of conduit. This is an example of secondary protection. This would allow this fuel line to slide through and be protected when it enters the building. And another thing that's very important, the seam on an oil tank should always be visible, whether it's an indoor installation or an exterior installation. So make sure that your oil tank seam is exposed so that it can be always seen, inspected, make sure there's no leaks. One other disadvantage an outside oil tank has over an inside installation is the fact that it's subject to a lot of extreme temperature changes. For example, during the night the oil tank cools down. Then in the morning, if the tank is located on the most southerly side of the house, it's subject to the sun and heat all day long. That causes extreme condensation buildup that eventually falls into the bottom of the tank and mixes with the oil, creating microorganisms to feed on the inside of the tank and actually rust the tank from the inside out. Now let's go take a look at an inside installation. We're now inside a rural farm home looking at an indoor tank. And this indoor tank we're looking at now is approximately the same age as the outdoor tank that we just looked at. This tank here is in much better condition. It has in place its ULC tag approval, showing it's a 12 gauge tank. It was manufactured in 2003. It's got the proper fuel level gauge in place that's working. The vent and fill pipe are in place, properly installed. However, as you can see, there is some overfilling occurring. And that happens from the fuel delivery. At the time of the fuel delivery, there's too much oil being forced into the tank and it's bleeding back through the threads on the top of the tank. It's not a serious problem, but it's something that should be dealt with. The fuel supplier should have a look at it, a technician brought in, maybe to reseal the joints on the top of the tank. On this tank, the seam is in the proper location. It's facing outward for easy inspection, not facing the wall hidden, so it can be inspected easily on a regular basis. And as we move to the front of this tank, we can easily see that this is now another bottom discharge tank, and the valve and filter discharge from the bottom, not the end of the tank. This homeowner is actually quite smart by putting a couple of absorbent cloths down. This way they can detect the smallest leak when it occurs and call a technician in to deal with it. One thing I'd like to point out, this particular line does not have the horizontal loop in place, which we like to see. The reason for the horizontal loop again is for expansion. This tank is installed on a solid concrete floor, not likely going to move. However, somebody could hook this line down here in the basement, moving a piece of furniture or kids running around, and that could jar one of the fittings and cause a serious leak. That's why you want the expansion loop. Another thing I'd like to point out is that prior to this tank being updated, you can see back here by the filter the original copper line encased in concrete. That's how things were done before the code was brought up. Those lines typically snapped off in the concrete and leaked and caused all kinds of environmental issues. Now let's have a look at preferred connections and filters. The lines and connections are equally as important as the filter. What we highly recommend is the solid T connection. When you're supplying from the oil tank to a furnace and possibly a hot water heater and other appliance, we highly recommend the T connection. And we recommend that the joints all be properly flared with a solid base nut on the copper pipe to avoid leakage. When we talk about the filters, we much prefer the black heavy-bodied filter with the cast top. This filter bolts right through securely with the proper O-ring in place, makes a really good fit. This light white canister, white metal top type filter doesn't give the protection of the heavy-bodied base filter. Moisture tends to eventually rust through these containers and cause losses. Let's all remember, it only takes 1 ounce of fuel oil to affect the resale value of your property, cause damage to the environment and your health. So let's all play our part and keep this contained.